So continuing on with our discussion of inheritance, I'm going to briefly talk about constructors. So you'll notice we've got our person class right here, and we have two constructors. We have an empty argument constructor that doesn't really do anything, and we have this constructor that accepts arguments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just add in a little bit of, so I'm going to add in a system.out.println just so we can see empty arg constructor called, actually we'll say person empty arg constructor called. Okay, and I'm going to copy this and put it here. And so we'll say and in this case, this will be our 3-argument constructor called. Okay, now the reason why I want to do this is I'm going to show you. So remember, we have our person class, okay? Then we have our employee class, which extends person, okay? So employee is a subclass of person, all right? And you'll notice that employee doesn't have its own constructor. All it has is it has a department attribute, a getter and a setter for that department, and then this do nothing that we were messing with in the last video. But it doesn't have its own constructor, okay? And so over here in our implementation class, we've created some employees. Well, we created this employee. This one we also have created a second employee, but we've set it to be a person. So if we go ahead and run this as is, okay? Notice, do you see down here? See how it says that the person empty arg constructor was called twice? Okay, so the point that I want to make here is that when you instantiate a new employee being a subclass, okay, this employee is actually going and it is calling this constructor. Okay. Now, what would happen if we made a constructor in employee similar to this? Okay, so what would happen if we did this? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say public employee, and then I'll do string name, and I'll do n a I, and I'll do set name n, set age a, and set ID I. Okay, so now I have a constructor in here, a 3-argument constructor. Okay, and if I go ahead and save this, okay, and oh, age is an integer, and ID is an integer. Okay, so let's just make sure that works. All right, no problems there. So now, if I go here into my implementation class, okay, I'm going to comment out all of this stuff here really quick. All right, so I'm going to make a new employee. Employee E3 equals new employee. And now because the only constructor that I have is a 3-argument constructor, I cannot just do new employee because it's going to complain and say there's no empty argument constructor. So I'll just go ahead and do Steve 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 32. Okay, now when I run this code, okay, so if I compile this and I run it, you will see that once again the person empty argument constructor is called. Okay, So even though here in employee, I have this constructor that accepts these 3 arguments, which basically kind of matches what's going on here, it's going to by default call the empty argument constructor. Now, if there are no constructors defined, then it's going to call the default constructor, right? And so there is a way you can tell it specifically which constructor you want it to call, okay? So I can say in here, instead of doing all of this, all right, what I can do is I can say super, and then I can pass in NAI, okay? Now super is, again, a reserved keyword in Java, and this is basically saying, all right, instead of going and calling the empty argument constructor, I want you to call a specific constructor that I'm telling you, okay? And so in this case, I'm telling you to call the 3 argument constructor in person, all right? Super has to be the first line in my employee constructor, and you can only use it in this fashion in a constructor, okay? So if I was to compile this now, okay, and then if I was to go back over here to my implementation class and run this, now you'll see that the person 3 argument constructor was called, okay? So the point of all this is that when you have a superclass subclass relationship, so because employee is a subclass of person, okay, when I instantiate a new employee object, like I did over here, okay, I created this new employee object, I'm calling at least 2 constructors. I'm calling the employee constructor, and then I am calling a constructor in the superclass, okay? So in this case, I've explicitly called this constructor, all right? But to put it another way, let's suppose I'm going to create a couple of new files. So I'm going to create a new file. So we'll do public class shape. And I'm not going to put anything in here. All right. And so I'm going to go ahead and save this as shape.java. Okay. And then I'm going to create a new class, public class rectangle extends shape. Okay. And I'm not going to put anything in here. All right. So now I've got rectangle. All right. And then over in my implementation class, I'm going to say rectangle R1 equals new rectangle, okay? And if I compile and run this, okay, now nothing happened because my things don't do anything, but what actually happened is when I instantiated a new rectangle, it went and it called a constructor for rectangle. Well, I haven't defined any constructor, so it called the default constructor, okay? It also went and it called the default constructor for shape, okay, because rectangle extends shape. So in other words, it executed 2 constructors. It executed the constructor for the superclass, and it executed the constructor for the subclass. All right? And the order in which it executes the constructors are, it executes the superclass constructor first. So if I was to go in here, and I'm just going to go ahead and stick in a little line here and say system.out.println executing, actually, I'll just employee 3arg constructor. Now, I'm going to comment out this super just to prove to you that it's doing what I say it is, okay? So in other words, when I instantiate an employee, okay, all it's going to do is it's going to print this out, and it's not going to explicitly call a constructor. So what's happening here, if I go back to my implementation class, is you'll see that first it calls the superclass constructor, and then it calls the subclass constructor, okay? So in this line of code right here where I have employee E3 equals new employee, before it actually executes this constructor here, it goes and it executes the empty argument person constructor. Now, I can, instead of having it execute the person empty argument constructor first, I can get it to execute a different person empty argument constructor by using this super keyword. Okay? So if I did that, then it's going to okay. Now it calls the person 3 argument constructor first, and then it calls the employee 3 argument. Okay? So that's the order in which it does that. So you should be aware that when you have these superclass subclass relationships, you have a situation where multiple constructors are being called implicitly. And if you want to specify which ones you call, then you can use that super keyword like we did right here.